Hey guys, welcome to lesson 11 of the biology unit um, of the online modules. I wanted to mention something quick off the top here. A number of students have mentioned to me that they're concerned about deadlines, that they're getting a little bit behind a particular deadline, or they're worried about handing in something late. You shouldn't be worrying about that at all. So if you need like an extra day to finish a module or like extra couple days, that's totally fine. If you don't want to write the quiz on the Friday because you need more time to look over your notes, or you haven't had an opportunity to do a particular thing in a particular module, please don't feel compelled to have to hand in the quiz on a particular day. So you can absolutely write the quiz later whenever you feel prepared. So there really are no time limits here. The reason that I'm giving you like deadlines associated with the assignments, like on Classroom, is just so you have some indication of when you should be handing these things in order to kind of stay on track towards the end of the semester. So, I mean, if you're falling a little bit behind, it's not a big deal. If you are falling behind and you're and it's because you're having difficulty with something in the modules, please let me know. Contact me. And if you are just busy with work or family stuff or personal stuff, whatever, just don't be afraid to just let me know that on the little surveys at the end of the week. Just either add it as a private comment on the survey, or in the like indicated question, just mention that you are falling behind, and then you can just say at the bottom part like what you need help with, or whether or not you need any help. Maybe you don't need help and you just need to take a little time and you're falling a little bit behind. That's not a big deal, but just maybe keep me apprised of what's going on with you. I just want to make sure that I'm supporting you if you require any support. Okay, that being said, we spent last week looking at the organelles of the cell and just some basic stuff about cells, cell theory. This week, we're going to look into the cell cycle in a little bit more detail. Just a quick thing to mention, this is chapter 2.3 and 2.5 in your textbook. Chapter 2.4 is a lab, I believe, that we're not going to do. And so that's kind of the information that we're going to start covering today. Today is more about the cell cycle in general and a little bit about the specific steps of mitosis. You are going to you're going to do one of the Explore Learning activities, one of the gizmos about mitosis, and so you'll get a little bit of information about the steps of mitosis there. It's not hugely detailed. Then on Wednesday, we're going to go into more detail about mitosis, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about when cell regulation gets broken in cells, or when cells begin to divide out of control. So that's on Wednesday. Today is more basic information about the cell cycle. So by the end of the lesson, you should be able to describe what the steps of the cell cycle are. We're going to go over them a few times. And then some of the reasons behind cell division. So why do cells need to divide? And you should have at least a start in developing a picture of mitosis. What is mitosis, and what are the steps involved? So kind of what do they look like? We're going to go into that in detail a little bit more on Wednesday, but it is part of the gizmo activity. So you should start beginning to develop by the end of this lesson sort of a sense of what happens during mitosis, what does it look like, what are the steps, etc. Anyway, so that's the general outline of what we're going to cover here and what you should have by the end of this lesson. So I'm going to start by talking just about the idea of making new cells. It might surprise you to learn that in your body, and we mentioned way back, now it'd be last Monday, that you have trillions of cells. So, I mean, you got a lot. 1 million of them die every hour. Wow, that's a lot. So that would be things like your old skin cells are dying. Maybe if you have an injury to any part of your body, you might have some dead cells as a result of that. You've got cells lining your intestines, cells lining your stomach. Those things are dying. As are just cells, regular cells around your body. They're dying at regular intervals and they need to be replaced. So you got about 1 million dying every hour. You're also producing about 1 million an hour. So you got to make some new ones to replace them, obviously. For you, that number is actually probably greater than 1 million. Certainly it is for your neurons. So you're undergoing brain development at your age, hopefully. So as you're producing more cells than what are dying. And the same thing is true for probably a lot of your body cells. You guys are in a growth phase of your life. So that number is probably greater than 1 million. It would be about 1 million for an adult human. So what are the reasons you got to make new cells? Well, I kind of mentioned them already. First of all, you have to allow for growth. So that's the reason why organisms make new cells if you're multicellular. If you are a single-celled organism, you build a new cell to replicate, so to reproduce. But for multi-celled organisms like humans, it allows us to grow. If you have some dead or malfunctioning cells, you can replace those cells. When cells die, there's really 2 ways that they can become dead. So I'm going to discuss those 2 ways right now. So there's sort of 2 ways things can go. You can get programmed cell death. So that's like a cell is not really functioning properly anymore, and your body's like, okay, that cell, pack it up, give your materials to the neighboring cells, and kind of just get out of here. You can tell them to program their own cell death, or I guess you can call it cell suicide. So that's necessary when your cells are not functioning properly, or they're old, and they're taking up more resources than they should, or something like that in the body. You want apoptosis to occur. So apoptosis is controlled cell death, and that's totally normal. That happens all the time in your body when the cells are not functioning properly anymore. They're at the end of their life cycle. They apoptose. You can also get necrosis. So necrosis is when, and so this is the bad one. So this is when instead of getting a programmed cell death, your cells just die from whatever reason. Maybe they're lysed by a virus. Maybe they are, a lyse just means broken, like the cell's ruptured. Maybe you froze some of your tissue. So you got frostbite, and that causes tissue death. So if you freeze your tissue, or for some other reason the tissue dies, maybe it doesn't get enough oxygen or whatever, that causes necrosis. So necrosis is an unexpected, non-programmed cell death. When you get that kind of cell death, it causes all the stuff that's inside the cell to basically just rupture and like fly out into the intercellular fluid, which is, associated, it's part of your blood. And so when you get just parts of the cell rupturing, going all over the place, that it activates an immune response, and it causes inflammation, and there's all kinds of negative processes that are associated with necrosis. If you got frostbite enough, you could potentially, cause a type of systemic problem. It could potentially lead to your death. So necrosis is bad. You don't want that to happen. But anyway, either way, if you got cells that are dead or dying, you need to build new ones. And then the last part here is that you got to heal damage. So if you've cut yourself, you got a gap there. You got to fill in the gap with some new cells or whatever. If you damage an organ for whatever reason, maybe chemically damage it because of something you've ingested or whatever, you got to heal that damage. You got to build new cells. So all those are reasons why you may want to produce new cells, and you're doing it all the time. As I mentioned a second ago, if you're a single-celled organism, really the only reason that you would want to create a new cell is for reproductive purposes. So that's called asexual reproduction when it's done in organisms that are single-celled. If you're making a copy of a cell, obviously now there are 2 individuals. Most animals use sexual reproduction, so that's when there is an exchange of genetic information between 2 members of the same species. They bring their genetic information together and produce an offspring. That's sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is when you just make an exact copy of yourself. And there are animals that do that as well, that can clone themselves. There are lots of plants that can do that. If you've ever taken a cutting from a plant and planted it and made a new plant out of it, that's asexual reproduction too. It's when the offspring are genetically identical to their parent, or when the DNA is exactly the same as the parent. So that happens in bacteria. They're producing exact copies of themselves. Anyway, either way, those cells are not giving birth. So you don't have like a sort of a reverse Pac-Man scenario where a cell is kind of folding in on itself and kind of like spitting out like a new cell. So that's not how it works. The process is very similar to you got a cell, and then it gets so large that the cell kind of cuts itself in half, and then both of those sort of daughter cells go their separate ways. So that process of cutting a cell in half and making two new cells is called binary division. So that's what cells do. And that would be the primary reproductive mechanism if you're a single-celled organism. If you're a multiple-celled organism, that's how you just grow and replace damaged cells. So I already mentioned the terminology here, but we call that the adult cell that's producing new cells. That's a mother, and it makes two daughter cells. So mother makes two daughters, and then the key thing here with mitosis, with this cell binary division that we're going to talk about here, is that we are producing exactly identical copies. It's really important that if you've got a liver cell and you do binary division, that you have two liver cells at the end. You don't have one liver cell and like another fat cell or something else, something weird. They have to be exactly identical at the end, and cells produce their same cell. That's how it works. I realize that it seems a little bit strange because at some point you've got to be able to make all these different types of cells in your body, but that happens during embryonic development, which we're going to talk about on a different day. So you have to replicate everything, and that's why we talked about all the organelles first. You got to go through and you got to make another Golgi, and you got to make some ER, and you got to make ribosomes, and et cetera, mitochondria. But the most important thing that you have to replicate is the DNA. So the DNA is responsible for building proteins and controlling the cell. That's what's in the nucleus. That is the blueprint for the cell and is responsible for controlling everything. And so that's really the critical piece. As long as you can get an exact copy of DNA into both daughter cells, those cells are going to be the same as the parent. If they don't have the right Golgi or they don't have the right ER, they can build it as long as they've got the right DNA. So you got to make an exact copy. So this is, because it's responsible for all of the cell functions, this is the most important part of making a new cell in the cell cycle. You got to make an exact copy of the DNA. We're going to come back to that later. But you'll notice when we talk about mitosis, which is that process of replicating the cell, that they always really focus in on the DNA component because that is the most important part. So the basic idea of the cell cycle here, the life cycle of a cell, is that your cell, and this is sort of like down here, this would be like a new cell. A new cell is formed. It spends most of its life in this phase right here. It's like the blue arrow here, and that's called interphase. Interphase is the cell just doing its cell job. And that kind of, I guess that makes sense, that most of the time cells are just doing their job. So if you're a liver cell and you're an interphase, you're doing liver functions like breaking down chemicals and storing glycogen and whatever you do as a liver cell. And if you are a blood cell, white blood cell in interphase, you are looking for invading bacteria and viruses, and you're breaking them down and eating them and doing whatever you do. So interphase is like the part of the life cycle of a cell where it's just doing its job. And you can break that up into three sort of sub phases. And those are G1, S, and G2. So G1 is right at the very beginning of a cell's life cycle. So you can think of, so this is all part of interphase, by the way. G1 is otherwise known as GAP1. G stands for gap. Is the part where the cell grows. That's what it's primarily doing during G1, which makes sense. It's a brand new cell. It's got to get bigger. It's got to build organelles. It's got to make protein. It's doing all this sort of beginner stuff that cells do at the beginning of their life. Then in the middle of its interphase, cells do the synthesis phase. That's S. So synthesis means to build. I don't know if you guys remember from chemistry. Hopefully you do. Synthesis is a type of chemical reaction where you build something out of smaller things. And DNA synthesis is just when you build DNA. So the synthesis phase is the phase where you make an exact copy of your DNA. So you have a certain amount of DNA you got to build the whole strip of DNA over again, make an exact copy of it. So that's the second part here, the S phase. So the S phase is doubling the cell's DNA, making an exact copy. In truth, it's not exactly identical because it's millions of code letters long, and that process is not perfect. So there are small errors that accumulate, but it's as close as you can make to an exact copy. So that's the idea anyway. And then the last part here, the G2 part of interphase, is the gap2 phase. And that's where you make the structures for dividing. So in that part of interphase, you are building all of the different stuff that we're going to talk about later in mitosis. You're going to build centrioles, you're going to build spindle fiber, start building spindle fibers, or at least the components for spindle fibers. Everything that you use to actually do the cell division is going to be built during the G2 phase. So this is sort of like the getting ready to do mitosis part. And during all three of these, the cell is just doing its job. So as I mentioned earlier here, this is cell. The cell does its job. Okay, so that's interphase. Interphase is the mature part of the cell's life cycle where it's just doing its thing. Then, once it's done G2 and it's got all that specialized equipment built, then it goes into the mitotic phase or mitosis. So mitosis is the part of the cell cycle where you actually take those 2 copies of your DNA and you separate them out to either end of the cell. So that's mitosis of the mitotic phase. The copies of DNA get separated and placed on opposite sides of the cell. So you take your DNA, take one copy and put it over here, take the other copy, put it over here, and then you got to put it in a new nucleus. And the last component of this is you have to cut the cell into 2. And that's actually a completely different part of the cell cycle. It's not really part of mitosis, but the very last part here is called cytokinesis. Cytokinesis just means cell movement, and that's because the cell chops in half and then the 2 parts move apart and become 2 separate cells. So that's the actual division part, cytokinesis. All right, that's the basics of the cell cycle. What you guys are going to do now is have a little bit of a closer look into the steps of mitosis, and that's through that gizmo. So you're going to go on the Explore Learning website and log in. There's one called Cell Division, I think is what it's called. And then attached to this assignment, you'll see a booklet for that. And you just follow it through step by step, just like you did with the last one. And it's going to get you to go through the steps of mitosis. You don't have to have them memorized at the end of this module, but you should have a general idea of what is happening during the mitotic process. And then on Wednesday, we're going to review it in a little bit more detail. But at this point, you're just looking to get like a general idea of what's happening in mitosis. And once you've done that, you can try the exit quiz. Okay, guys. Like I said, if you really are unsure about what I've been talking about here, Chapter 2.3 is what we just discussed. Chapter 2.5 in the textbook is the more in-depth discussion of mitosis, which we're going to cover again on Wednesday. So good luck with that, and let me know if you have any questions.